Howdy.
How's it going?
It's best in the off season.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at Halley Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to point out that we're located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I won't take up too much of your time this evening because we are gathered here specifically to hear from Curt Keilback and gathered to celebrate his book, 2 Minutes for Talking to Myself, Jets, Coyotes, Tales, and Opinions, hosted by Curt Keilback specialist, Luke Keilback. So just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. There'll be a conversation which will take place just to my left, after which there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. I'll circulate with the microphone, and even if you feel you can project very well, and I'm sure you can, we just ask you to use the microphone. That's just for the benefit of those watching the YouTube stream at home, just so they can hear your question as well. If you are watching on YouTube right now, please feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll put them to Curt as time permits. I'll be back at the end to go over some incredibly exciting details about how to get a book signed, so you can look forward to that. But the only thing I'll mention right now is that we'll just ask at the end of the event for you all just to remain in your seats for 1 moment while we safely transport Curt to a signing table right beside our cash desk where he'll be signing copies. Now you could say that this entire launch is just a purely selfish exercise to actually hear Curt's voice through the speakers here in the atrium. So we're pretty thrilled that we're going to be hearing that in just a moment, but it is also a fascinating look at an incredible career as well. So we'll be hearing even more about that in just a few moments. Curt Keilback was born to be a broadcaster. He did his first play-by-play at the age of 11, and by the time he was 13, he had his own weekly radio show. In his career, he called over 2,400 NHL games. Curt was born in Brandon, Manitoba, raised in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and now makes his home in Winnipeg. Your host for this evening, Luke Keilback, the author's son, is the father of 3 and a rec league hockey player. He lives in Winnipeg and earns a living as a behavioral therapist and sports psych consultant. He identifies as a veteran listener of campfire stories about hockey. Please join me in welcoming Curt and Luke Keilback.
Well, thank you, John. That's an interesting name to be introducing somebody. John Taves. You got a part-time job as a hockey captain in Chicago, have you? Anyway, it's good to be here. And it's a thrill, actually. I certainly never thought I'd be addressing a crowd over a book that I wrote. It's just something that kind of happened over the course of time. And my son Luke here can vouch for this. I probably told him stories ad nauseum, often the same story, and sometimes they did change a little bit. It was a habit I grew into due to one of my old friends who's sitting right here from 60 years ago, Dennis Schindel. He told me so many stories that they just got bigger and bigger, and I learned that's how to tell them. But anyway, what you read in the book is it's factual. It's not made up stuff, and a lot of it too is opinion. So there are stories about the Jets, stories about the Coyotes, stories about broadcasting, and opinions, which may get me in a little bit of hot water with some people, but I'm 74 years old. It can't hurt me anymore. So it's been a good career. It's been a fun career. And I look forward to sharing stories of the book with you. And we certainly, I don't plan on talking a lot right now because I want to know if anybody's got anything you want to know. And I know Luke's going to throw a couple of questions at me over the course of the evening, if you've got a couple. And then I'm going to read a couple of stories from the book that I hope you'll enjoy. And then afterwards, if you're so inclined, we'll sign something. All right.
That's funny because he talks about how the stories are factual. I know they are factual because I heard a lot of the fish tales growing up around the fire pit. And those stories, they got better and they got better and they got better. They got more and more interesting and more wild. And then he started writing a book. And I'd hear him scurrying around upstairs, divvying through papers, looking through papers, trying to confirm that the story that he told for 20 or 30 years was in fact true. Is that how it went? I'm gonna have to call up Peter Young. I'm gonna have to call up or whoever and try to find
Thomas Steen was
Verification.
another source. Yeah.
that these stories were going on. So I am absolutely a veteran listener of these stories. You know, and it's been, my dad is a great storyteller. He's also a pretty humble guy. And so it's interesting to see him writing a book, and I really did enjoy it. When I first read it, I just poured through it because I was like, geez, don't say anything, you know, too ridiculous in here. And I read through it in about an hour and a half, and I was entertained and laughed, and it was definitely a good read. So I do have a few questions to throw over to him here if need be. You know, having known and read some of the stories, but also heard many others. And yeah, I think you could fill up another few books for sure. So, you know, should you want me to start? I'm going to give you a couple questions.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote them down on the way here because he didn't tell me. He stole my name, my likeness, put it up on posters.
I didn't tell you.
Yeah, and I get here and he goes, there's your chair. So this is all sort of, you know, off the cuff here. I'm gonna do my best. But on the way here, in case there was trouble and we weren't gonna get any questions, I wrote down a few. Because, you know, I've been in a couple of these things, and sometimes you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting for questions. You say, geez, they gotta plant somebody in the audience to ask them. So I came prepared as a plant. And then he threw me up here at the front. So I got one real easy one for you. I'll throw you a softball first of all, and I've heard the answer to this question a million times. But Curt,
Yes,
who was your favorite broadcaster growing up?
actually, I had two. One was natural. It was my father, Jim Keilback, who broadcast for the Winnipeg Warriors and the Phoenix Roadrunners and the Yorkton Terriers and the Regina Caps. And he did the rounds. And the other was a guy that some of you who are a similar vintage to me will remember, Danny Gallivant, who did the Montreal Canadian games on Hockey Night in Canada. And he had a tremendous way of putting things, and there was no Homer tone to me as far as his broadcasts were concerned. And they had a command of the vocabulary. Both he and my dad had a tremendous command of the vocabulary. I could certainly never match either one of them in that regard, but I tried to do what they did in terms of making the games as exciting as possible, because hockey is entertainment. And every once in a while, you'll find a game that's not very good. And I always considered the greatest compliment I could get was when somebody would be at a game and say it was boring. And I talked to my friend who listened to it on the radio, and she said it was really good. So I thought, well, I must have done something right that night. And that's, you're part of the package when you're doing a broadcast. And I think you're a salesman. You're a salesman, because it's a great sport. It's Canada's national sport. And I suppose it applies to other sports as well. Football, I mean, the Bombers are pretty exciting this year. So yeah, those two guys are the guys that I followed most closely.
That's funny about the homerism there, because I've for however many years we've watched sports together, he just cringes at the homers that are involved in the game these days. So, you know, the teams tend to hire the play-by-play guys these days, I think, or at least it seems that way. And they do get real excited about the home team scoring and real down about the other team scoring. And I remember, you know, him telling me about how that's just not the way it's done. At least that wasn't the way it used to be done. And, you know, when he was down in Phoenix, sometimes I would make the mistake of reading through the comments in some of the social media posts there. Most of them were really great. Most of them, you know, really enjoyed the broadcast. But every once in a while, you'd get somebody who was just like, I'm sitting in the other room and I hear he scores. And I come running back to the TV and it's the other team, and just super, you know, angry about it. It's just, but I cringe now when I hear how you know, the big time homers that the guys doing the play-by-play seem to be these days. Then again, there's people who really enjoy it. And I know that I have some friends who say the same thing, right? They want the home team guy to cheer, you know, heavily for the home team. It's just a little bit different way of doing things. There's a couple stories in the book about that. I think you.
Yeah, there is. I got a story in there about homerism, and I particularly took a shot at the Minnesota Vikings radio broadcasters. Because, yeah, they're wow, cheerleaders. Anyway, if anybody's got any questions you want to ask, feel free. And I know John is around here. John, yeah, there he is. He's around here. He's going to hop around with his microphone and take the question.
What was the name of your radio show when you were 13, and how did you get a radio show when you were 13?
Well, it was called Minor Sports Corner. And, well, I guess you call it nepotism. I think my whole career based on nepotism. One day, my dad said to me, some of the guys thought you might be good on the radio, because I was kind of born with a different kind of voice. And and they knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I had this show every Saturday at 1:30 for 5 or 10 minutes. And as I said in the book, I generally didn't go that long. And I would be very factual. I didn't know how to talk between, so the score was 3-2. And one time, in fact, and I wasn't a very good player, but one time our team lost the game 4-3. And I had my only hat trick of the whole season, of my life. So I gave the results of the game and I said, meanwhile, the Cougars were beaten by the Blackhawks 4-3, Blackhawk goals by Smith, Jones, Green, and Brown. And I went to the next. I couldn't say Curt Keilback scored 3 goals for the Cougars. But you know, you talked about homers before, and it's mentioned in the book too that some people, it is a condition of their employment. They're hired that way, so you got to excuse that anyway. But yeah, it was interesting to do that show when I was 13, but I wouldn't recommend it. It was kind of a pressure situation. And it was a little bit tough. And then I remembered it got to the point I was in grade 9 and I was elected the room representative, which meant I had to go to the student council meetings. So one of the people at the radio station said, you know what, we should give an hour show to YCI, which was Yorkton Collegiate. And Curt, you can host it. Well, when you're in grade 9 and you go into these student council meetings and you're the youngest person in the room and the station plays country music and you're in a high school, you're afraid to even mention the radio station. So as a result, I didn't follow through on that show, but I could have had an afternoon DJ show at that age too, if I followed through on it.
Well, there's a question right there from the beautiful Dre Keilback.
Ah, the lady Dre.
Hi. Okay, 2 questions. Did you play hockey when you were younger? Yes or no?
One word answer. I'm not used to those. Yes.
I mean, well, and then, okay. And what team did you play for?
Well, I played for different teams, different club teams. And the highest I got was the Bantam All-Stars, but
It's a check fact. We're gonna do some fact checking.
yeah.
I guess I missed that.
Well, I was kind of a bit player. I wasn't one of the first liners, but I did get to play. Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, things were a little bit different from when they play now. In Yorkton, there was no artificial ice. So you played hockey when the ice froze at the school at the end of November. And then in February, it got a little lumpy because there'd always be the Bonspiel thaw. And by March, that was it. You were playing shitty. So that had an excuse. That's why I can't skate.
Curt, yeah, I remember you told me this when we were talking. When you were 13 doing that radio show, you had Gord Rublet, somebody came and you had a funny story about him disappearing just as you're going to do the interview. We were talking about how nervous you were to do that show.
Yeah, I do remember that story. I had somebody came in to do an interview. And of course, in those days, I was only 13. So if I had a question, I didn't answer it by looking at you. I asked it by reading it. So I read this scripted question I had, and then I looked at the guy I asked the question to, and he was gone. I didn't know where he was. He was under the table tying his shoe. Well, it caused me a little bit of panic at that time, but yeah, we got through it.
I'm 42, 43 years old now. I'm looking down at my script. What's my next question? So, it's all right. And speaking of that nepotism, this guy gets jobs 13 years of age doing, reporting the sports. The nepotism in my direction is you sit down and there's your chair. Help host.
You're lucky boy.
I guess, yeah. I got a question. Is there one in the back there? Okay, give her.
Yeah, quick question. What was your favorite or most memorable game to call and why?
There were 2 of them, and I think everybody could probably figure out which 2 they were, possibly even a third. But one of them was when Teemu scored goals 52, 53, and 54. That was an incredible achievement. It's well documented in the book. And the most impressive part about that was the fact that he needed to score 7 goals in only 2 games to do it at home before going on a 5-game road trip. And people were convinced he was going to do it. I certainly wasn't among them, but he did it, and it was really exciting. And the other very obvious one was the time Dave Ellett scored that double overtime goal. And they've replayed that goal a million times. I have never heard my call of it because it was on Hockey Night in Canada. And I was doing radio at that time. I'd like to hear it because it was a tremendous, tremendous moment. And every single person thought that, oh, Luke's got a story about this one too, don't you? Yeah, I want to tell that story. The villain is it. But every single person thought that the Jets were finally going to vanquish the Oilers. But of course, that fell through. Luke, tell your story about the day Dave Ellett scored the double overtime goal.
Well, I can't really tell much of the story because once we got through to after the first overtime, my mom, ever the champion for scholastic activity, turned to me and said, "Luke, it's a school night. It's time to go home." And we drove home, and I heard the call that you're talking about as we were pulling into the garage. The Jets had won, and I will never let her live with that, ever. But I do have a follow-up question. Were the 80s Oilers as arrogant as they seemed in real life?
Well, there was an arrogance, definitely, and it came from the top. Glenn Saylor, their coach and general manager, was the most arrogant man I ever met. And it was funny because it kind of spread out through the system. And their newspaper guys got to be somewhat that way. Their radio guy, though, he wasn't. He was okay. Rod Phillips, I never thought of him that way. But even their public relations guy, you got the impression that he won the Stanley Cup. So yeah, but it's something that kind of infiltrates into hockey, because I can remember when the Detroit Red Wings weren't doing so well, and you'd go to interview the Red Wings, and you'd walk into the dressing room, there was no problem. Then they won a Stanley Cup. Now you got to walk into the dressing room and, whoa, where are you going? You can't go in there without my permission. And it kind of changes everybody once they win. And hopefully when it happens here, people will stay below that. We got a question here from number 12.
Number 12, Knox Keilback.
Have you ever broadcasted when they won a Stanley Cup?
No, that'll never be a part of my resume, unfortunately.
When was the last championship you broadcast?
Wow.
I read that in the book today. So he doesn't even know his own stories. So many stories.
No. Well, because I've got it in the book, and you got to read it. If you read between the lines, it doesn't even tell you then. I was the voice of the Yorkton Terriers when they won the Western Canada Senior Championship, or pardon me, the Saskatchewan Senior Championship. And then I was also the voice of the Regina Pats when they won the Memorial Cup. But I didn't finish the year. I crashed my car at Christmas time and quit my job, went and drove cab in Jasper. In fact, when they won that final game, the Memorial Cup tournament was in Calgary. I drove my cab to the top of a mountain in Jasper, and I was able to get the Calgary radio broadcast. And I sat there in my car looking out over the mountains and wondering, why am I here and not there? But anyway, yeah, that's as close as I got there.
Kurt, what year was that with the Pats? Was that what?
74.
74. That was with Gillies and Sawchuk.
There was Mike Hawerchuk, Clark Gillies, Dennis Sawchuk, Greg Jolly, Eddie Stanowski, Robbie Laird.
Dave Faulkner?
Pardon me?
Dave Faulkner? And he was on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Funny one.
Oh, we'll say hello to him.
Yeah. He's scouting for Prince Albert now.
Those old Yorkton Terrier stories, in my mind, these guys were absolutely monstrous gorillas. Like the stories that he would tell, you could really paint a picture quite well, and it's evidenced in the book. But if I can, compare the stories about, what was it, Jerry James and some of the other guys there on that team, just must have been the biggest, toughest guys you've ever met in your life. You see them and meet them years later as an adult, some of them. It's like, oh, hello there, sir.
Well, I'll tell you what, you mentioned the toughest of them all was Jerry James. He played football with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers as a fullback when he was a teenager, straight out of Kelvin High. And then he also played with the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Yeah, I remember him telling me a story one time, and you hear about all these stories about Gordie Howe. And Jerry James was a guy that liked to mimic people. He'd get under your skin in any way he could. So one day he was sitting on the bench at a game in Toronto when they were playing against Gordie Howe. And Gordie Howe had a tendency to wince. So of course, James picked up on this. And every time Gordie Howe would look over to him, he'd be wincing. Well, Gordie just happened to be skating down the wing. And the last wince that James made was with about a 6-inch cut down the side of his face and just continued right on going. So, yeah, he was a tough.
Hi, Curt. Brian Smiley here. I traveled 9 years covering the Winnipeg Jets with the Winnipeg Sun, and I spent a lot of time with Curt and some of these other guys I wouldn't miss this evening for the life of me. It was tremendous to see your book, and congratulations. A couple of questions. Well, one question. Randy Carlyle or Muriel Marois, who was the worst interview and the most curmudgeon kind of guy?
Actually, you know, I like both of those guys because I like grumpy guys. I mean, I worked with Friar Nicolson. I raised him. So yeah, I like grumpy people, but yeah, they were tough to approach a lot of times, but you could soften both of them up. And in particular, I had good relationships with both of them. In fact, Randy Carlyle was a color man with us for a year before he was hauled off to work with the hockey team. And Mario was a real character, but he had an interesting story because when he came to Winnipeg, he hated it. He didn't want to come here. He'd come from Quebec. It's in the book. And he'd been the captain of the Nordique. He got traded to Winnipeg, and in his mind, it was an outpost. He got here 3 years later. He was brokenhearted that they traded him away, and they traded him back to Quebec. So he fell in love with the place, which I think is a good sign for Winnipeg.
Did you like flying?
Well, no, he was always the guy that would sit in the back of the plane, and Brian Smiley would remember this. All of a sudden, the ride would get a little bumpy, and it was commercial flights, and you'd hear, and I can't do a French accent very well, but he'd say, "We're all gonna die." And of course, that would battle him through the plane. And some of the guys like Ron Wilson, who flew with the team and was with the team, was a scared flyer to begin with. He'd be panicking, and yeah, it was always a character.
Yeah, if you look back at the 1980s, do you think now, would you say that John Ferguson, he probably did a better job than a lot of people think? You know, don't forget he was in the role too. They did draft Teemu, but I guess he had the unfortunate problem that the Oilers had Wayne Gretzky, and the Jets had a good team, but they just couldn't match.
Well, the best team the Jets ever had, in my estimation, was 1985. And that was still under the original general manager, John Ferguson. They had Dale Hawerchuk and Dave Ellett and Dave Babych and Laurie Boschman and Thomas Steen. And that was a tremendous hockey team, Doug Smale. So yeah, they could have won it all. Randy Carlyle and Mario came along, I think, the next year. But they had Robert Picard. So it was a heck of a team. And the only thing, and it's interesting, you know, when you talk to some of the Jets from that era, and I always thought the same thing, and I confirmed it in conversations with the late Dale Hawerchuk and also with Dave Ellett. They claim the biggest difference in 1985 was not Gretzky, was not Coffey, was not Curry, it was Grant Fuhr. The Winnipeg Jets had Brian Hayward, he wasn't Grant Fuhr. And if you'd had the goaltenders at the opposite ends of the net, opposite ends of the ice, I think it would have been a Stanley Cup that year in Winnipeg.
We had 6 20-goal scorers.
6 30-goal scorers. And that's not been done since.
That's unheard of now. It won't happen again.
Yeah. Well, I got a couple of stories.
No,
Okay.
you got Mr. Teemu
Okay.
there.
This will be loaded.
It's not a question, Curt, it's just a comment about your career. Going back 35 years ago, all the Jets TV was blacked out in Winnipeg. So you just couldn't get a Jets game on TV.
Sure did a lot for the radio ratings, though.
Sure did. However, I can remember going to the Pembina Hotel. Young Drucksmann owned the Pembina at that time. And you'd phone in the morning at 8 or 9 in the morning and you get the tape recording. We're 99.99% sure we're getting the game tonight. So people would flock to the Pembina to watch the game on TV. He found it on children's channels, he found it on religious channels, he found it on cooking channels, but the game got there. So as soon as the game came on, boom, strict silence from the TV. CJOB went on, all the speakers in the Pembina Hotel. We had the game on TV and The Voice. The Voice.
Yeah, that was always flattering. But you know, the thing that would bother me about that, I know a lot of times it'd be on tape delay. So the radio would be on time and so I'd be calling the goal before it was scored, from what I understand. So it wasn't that I was that brilliant. That was just okay.
And you know, we're talking a little bit about the, you know, the best teams and some of the unfortunate luck of the Jets. There was a documentary movie made, sort of almost like a Fringe festival thing that we talked about. It was called something about a box of popcorn. Do you remember anything about that?
Yes. In fact, there's a book by Jeff Ferguson. It's called Broken Ribs and Popcorn, which is selling right here, and it's been successful. But the Jets had all the momentum in one particular game, and it looked as though they were going to win the game. And the Oilers were in complete disarray, and some fans threw a box of popcorn on the ice. And there was a long delay while they cleaned up the popcorn. And while they did that, the Oilers huddled around their bench, and they got their act back together. And they came back looking like the Oilers always had looked. And there were some, including Mike Smith, who I think was the general manager at that time, who were convinced that had it not been for the box of popcorn, they'd have won that game in that series. And it's lore.
Yeah. What about, speaking of stuff being thrown on the ice, and I actually remember a time when I was sitting, we used to get some pretty good seats on account of him being up in the press box. I remember being about my son's age, about 8, maybe a little bit older, 9 years old, and just being absolutely amazed that somebody had climbed up on the glass right in front of me, taken their salted, whatever, I don't know, it was popcorn or if it was barbecue peanuts or something like that, right over the glass and dumped it right on Don Kowarski's head. And you know what happened? He stood there, didn't move, with his arms crossed, and the linesman came and picked up all the nuts all around. He didn't even move. It's ridiculous. What about peanut butter night? Do you remember anything about peanut butter night?
Yeah. Do you want me to read the story?
Yes, I do. I want you to read the story.
That's not the story I was going to read, but I'll repeat it.
We're going off the cuff here.
Oh, yeah. Well, I could.
There's your seat. You're hosting. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, you keep talking because I got to find what page it's on. I don't know where it is.
Well, it's going to take a while.
Yeah. You know what? I'll read Peanut Butter Night later because that'll give me a chance to look for it. In the meantime, I'm going to read a story about Theo Fleury that I think people will enjoy. Of course, Theo was a rural Manitoba guy from Russell.
One time we ran into him at Mississippi, took the chairlift up with him, and then on the way out, he helped us push the truck out.
Yeah, we got stuck.
Terrible. Yeah, I don't even start to drive.
The story is called Gotcha. Theo Fleury of the Calgary Flames was worth the price of admission. He was an entertainer with great talent and an incredible knack for getting under the skin of opponents and fans alike. He was a pest. Opposing players couldn't do a whole lot about it either. Due to Fleury's diminutive stature, if you pummeled him, you were seen as a bully. Plus, you'd have to answer to a very big and very surly bunch of Calgary Flames. Jets goaltender Rick Tabaracci found that out the hard way. He stepped out of his net and slammed into Fleury in a game in Winnipeg. The hit drew a standing ovation. However, the teams met again 2 days later, and early in the first period, Flames Gary Roberts took a fearsome run at Tabaracci. Late one season, the Flames and Jets played a key game in Calgary. The score was 3-3 with 10 minutes left when Fleury went down to the ice, writhing in agony. Jet Brent Ashton was assessed a 5-minute spearing penalty. Fleury stayed down for several minutes. He was helped to the bench, and when he got there, he began laughing. He hadn't been hurt at all. The Jets were able to weather the 5-man disadvantage, only to lose 4-3 in overtime. And to rub it in, the overtime goal was scored by Fleury, and he laughed again.
Yeah, he laughed at us pushing the truck out too. Oh, what's this? More questions from the.
So, also 2 questions. How many pages are in your book first?
How many pages?
Yeah.
Well, it looks like there are 200 and
200 and some and about 100 stories, I think.
204.
Oh, yeah, that was my second question. How many stories are there? Do you know?
Close to 200.
Okay,
Now, they're mostly short stories. There's the odd story that may take a page and a half, and the odd story that is about a line and a half. So, yeah, they vary.
okay.
I have two questions too. Is there any chapters?
Yeah, there are 5 chapters. First chapter is the original Jets. The second chapter is the later Jets. The third chapter is general stuff. The fourth chapter is, and I know this is not very popular here, Phoenix. And the 5th chapter is broadcasting stories and opinions.
Also, why did you choose broadcaster?
Well, it was just something I always wanted to do in Oxford. My dad did it, your great grandfather, and I enjoyed listening to him. And I went and I had the opportunity to join both him and the legendary Cactus Jack Wells in the broadcast booth on several occasions. And I never saw 2 guys look like they enjoyed their work more than those 2 guys did. And when you're 8 years old and you see that, and you're thinking, man, would I ever like to do that for the rest of my life? And I was lucky enough to be able to do it.
Okay, so I think I've told you this before, and you don't have an answer to it. But my substitute teacher in grade 2 said that he knew you. And then one time in grade 1, I told you, and you're like, oh yeah, that guy. And then just this year, I told you about him, and you were like, who the heck is that?
Yeah, you know,
That's
Greg,
something, yeah.
that's a problem that I have.
Yeah.
And I've got a terrible memory for names and faces. I can remember names and numbers, faces and numbers, but names and faces I don't.
Yeah.
So so if anybody's getting something signed by me and you're coming up to me and I hesitate a little bit in giving you a name, there's a reason for that. It's nothing new. It's nothing to do with being 74. I was doing it when I was 24. You know, I remember one time I was doing a signing thing with the Winnipeg Jets at their carnival. And I could see somebody coming up and he wanted me to sign something. And it was somebody that I had seen so many times and it was driving me nuts. So I made small talk with him, trying to think of his name, and he didn't give it away. And then I said, so you want it signed to yourself? He said, yes. So I thought, well, I'll be really brilliant. I'll say, so how do you spell that? And he said, R-O-N. Busted. So I won't use that.
Yeah. It's nothing personal. Oh, go ahead.
Well, Curt, now that we're in the safety of Winnipeg and far away from Massachusetts, what are your thoughts on Mike Smith, the former GM, hockey genius or madcap professor?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. You know, I was one of the few people, Smiles, who got along with Mike. Mike was very good to me, and I always had a lot of respect for him, but I knew he was extremely unpopular. And I knew a lot of people didn't understand him and didn't like him. He was, and I got a couple stories about it. He was antisocial. There's no question about it. You could not make small talk with a man. If you went out and said, boy, it's a nice day, he would ignore you. But if you asked about what was going on in Ukraine, he'd talk forever. So he was an educated man. He was a doctorate. He had a doctorate in sociology or whatever it was. And so he did, though, madcap professor in some regard, in that he had a total infatuation with Russians. He wanted Alexei Zhamnov to be more successful than Teemu Selanne. I know that for a fact. And of course, that didn't quite work out.
We have a question from Gary Lawrence online. He was wondering if you could share another favorite memory or a favorite play-by-play.
Well, yeah, favorite memories. I think we talked a little bit about them before. The season that Selanne had and the 1985 season where they had the 630 goal scorers and of course the Elliott goal. But the most exciting seasons were those two. The 85 season when I was convinced that they were going to win the Stanley Cup. And I remember that at the end of the year, they had a 13-game unbeaten string. But you recall too that year, that was the year that Dale Hawerchuk got his ribs broken when they beat Calgary, and you could kind of see the end was at hand. Plus, Grant Fuhr was standing up there as well. So those were all exciting times. When you do 2,400 games, and there are an awful lot of moments that stand out. And unfortunately, I never had one of those moments where I say, "They won the Stanley Cup."
It is incredible though that Selanne memory that everybody has, and that there was people there that were expecting that he was going to get that hat trick that night. And you know, you think about it. We were at the Selanne honoring last week, and they were showing some of the footage from around the crowd. And remember that sign? Everybody probably remembers that sign. 52, 53, 54. Bossy's record is no more. Those people made that sign expecting him to get a hat trick, held it there, and were right about it. One of the things he said, talks about in the book, is going and speaking with some people in the crowd right before the game.
Yeah, every single person I spoke to before the game, without any hesitation, said they were there to see Teemu's hat trick. And he got it. He got the first goal 15 seconds in. And of course, the last one in the third period, when he won the race to the puck with a goaltender and flipped it into the empty net. What a classic moment.
Who is your favorite player on the Jets? Well, when you were broadcasting, who was your favorite?
My favorite player?
Yeah.
Sitting right beside you.
Number 12.
Number 12. Yeah, I never miss one of his games, do I? No, I've been asked that before, and that's I can't answer that question, Drake, because there were so many class acts. I mean, people like we've talked about Teemu Selanne and Dale Hawerchuk, and Tim Waters was a special person, and Dave Ellett and Laurie Boschman. I'm missing a whole lot of guys, and they were, Smiles can tell you that the Jets per se were a pretty good bunch of guys. There weren't too many giant egos, not too many people that you had any trouble talking to. They were very accommodating, and that was certainly a big part of making my job a lot more enjoyable. And one of the reasons why I didn't really consider it a job, it was just fun to go to work every day. The worst part about doing the Winnipeg Jets was the travel, because it was all commercial airline. Nowadays, it's the easiest part because it's all on charter. You get there a half hour before and you're gone on a luxury liner, and you don't have to make these pit stops in Minneapolis every second day of your life. How many hours did we spend there, Smiles?
Hours. TCBY was my favorite stop.
Anyway, so I'm going to read one more story.
There's a question there.
Okay.
Yeah. Speaking of, you mentioned the Selanne and Newman honoring. I was just wondering if you could comment a bit on the current Jet organization, sort of bridging back to the 80s and 90s Jets, and comment a bit on that connection and how that, connects Winnipeg hockey fans across generations.
I think it's great. I don't think it's any secret that in the early days, the current Jets had wanted nothing to do with the original Jets. In fact, I know that there was even a ruling that they did not want the camera people to show people in the stands at Jet games wearing old Jet jerseys. They were trying to totally disassociate. It was one of the reasons why they were so hesitant to call them the Jets. And now suddenly there's been a changeover, and it's been a great thing. And it, there was the Hawerchuk thing, of course, which was, well, it was a different circumstance altogether. But then when they honored Teppo Numminen and they honored Teemu Selanne, and I even got a salute there. I think it was really it was great to see, and I think it's going to continue. And I know some of the alumni of the Winnipeg Jets are appreciative too, because it was a different feel for them in the early days. But it's really great to see them embracing their past as opposed to erasing it.
Can I do one more?
Yep.
Curt, I know that Ken Friar Nicolson was a pretty special guy to you. Can you say a few words about him?
He was my mentor. He taught me a lot of things, and it's well documented in the book. And I think you'll enjoy the stories I told about some of his diabetic attacks that happened in the middle of hockey games and in the middle of restaurants and everything else. But he was a fireball. I mean, anything could come out of his mouth, and sometimes did. And there were occasions when he would call for a commercial break, and the first word after the commercial was something that shouldn't be heard on the air. And I'd always get scared that it got carried over, but we had very good operators that would cut his mic off. But he was, as I wrote to the caption under the picture of him, he could be cantankerous and charismatic at the same time. And he was just great to me, great man to me. And he was the guy responsible for my being here.
We used to go over to his place when I was a really young kid, and he would be just sitting there smoking cigars and telling it like it is.
And nobody could tell a story like the Friar. You know, we'd have gatherings, and of course, there'd be a lot of big name hockey players there, and they'd all be at the front, and people would come up to get their autographs. By about a half hour after the thing had ended, almost everybody would be at the table where Friar was, because he'd be sitting there captivating people with stories of growing up in Thunder Bay and stories about the WHA Jets. And nobody could tell a story like the Friar.
Except maybe your other color man right there.
Oh, Big Dead Shindo, yeah. The mayor of Portersville Prairie.
Here, I got two stories queued up there for you. I don't know which ones you want to do.
Well, I was going to do the one about Peter Young.
It's okay for now, not to speak.
I think I'll use this one about Peter Young because I think it might be a name that people here can identify with. He was a longtime sportscaster on CKOI. Now he's retired, still living in Winnipeg. The Jets were chartering home immediately after another playoff loss in Edmonton when sportscaster Peter Young decided to go to the front of the plane and share a story with John Ferguson. Young mentioned that he had recently been at Wayne Gretzky's house for a barbecue and had a great time. It was not what Ferguson needed to hear at that moment. The Jets general manager hissed, then he growled, then he exploded. It was a scene right out of the comic books. Peter broke into a dead run toward the back of the plane, hollering, "I'm sorry, John, I'm sorry." Ferguson was hot on his heels, shaking his fist and barking expletives. Calm was eventually restored, although Fergie continued to fume. Young, meanwhile, was left to ponder the realization that had it been possible to open a window, he could have received a whole different indoctrination into the 30,000-foot club. So that was one of the things that happened. And did you find Peanut Butter Night?
I did. Peanut Butter Night's queued up there.
Okay, it's right there. All right, we'll do Peanut Butter Night and then we'll get it. All right. November 8th of 1992 was Peanut Butter Night at the Winnipeg Arena. Every fan was given a jar of peanut butter upon entering the building. The visitors were the lowly Ottawa Senators. It was their second season in the league, and they weren't very good. They were a team the Jets had to beat to stay in a playoff hunt. Late in the game, the Jets appeared in control with a 6-4 lead. Then at 18-12, Ottawa's Dave Archibald scored to make it 6-5. The crowd began to mumble. Moments later, the mumbling turned to grumbling when Bob Kadelsky tied it to force overtime. Then the unthinkable. Kadelsky struck again. The mumbling and grumbling turned to rumbling, and airborne jars of peanut butter came tumbling to the ice. Hundreds, maybe 1,000 of them. The goalies hid in their nets. Players, coaches, and officials raced for cover. The ice was a mess, bathed end to end in unsightly brown lumps. It looked like the rodeo had been through. Nobody was hurt, but ever after freebies were handed out of the exits. The next morning, in an effort to short circuit the embarrassment, the Jets made a move. They stripped Dean Kennedy the captaincy and gave the C to Keith Tkachuk.
Problem solved.
But anyway, the ice, you didn't want to see that ice. It did look like something under the rodeo.
I was just gonna ask for your opinion, which do you think was more devastating for the organization when Jamie McCown, I think it was an 85 deck, Hawerchuk knocked them out, or when they blew the 3-game lead against the Oilers in 1990. They were both pretty hard to swallow, but I thought they would have might have changed things.
Yeah, well, that time at 85, like you say, when Dale's ribs were broken and they're coming against that powerhouse in Edmonton, you know, you kind of had a feeling that might happen, even though they'd had the great year once they had lost their number one center. But I think that it was more devastating what happened, even though that team you're talking about that lost in 7 games to Edmonton wasn't nearly as good a team as the 85 team. But they had done it through committee. They used 4 lines all year long and they had great success and they kept alternating goaltenders. And ultimately, I think that's what destroyed them. They played the wrong goaltender in some of those games when they went with Stefan Beauregard. When they had Bob Essens sitting there healthy and all he ever did was win. So it made no sense.
9-year-old me or however old I was Beauregard. We were in for Beauregard for sure. Ever since then, I've been told I was wrong.
Well, the coaches obviously felt the same way you did. The coaches were Bob Murdoch and Claire Drake and Alpo Suanen. And I can remember having lunch with them that day. And Bob had gone to the washroom. And I said to Alpo and Claire, I said, do you guys agree with this coaching selection tonight? They said, absolutely. So I know the players didn't, I didn't, but I didn't get a call on it, obviously. And who knows, they might have lost anyway.
Last question out of the front row there from the Keilbacks.
Have you kept in contact with any of the Jets players?
Yes, I see them once in a while. There are functions that happen now and then. And
Golf tournaments.
And there are several of them who remain in Winnipeg. The alumni who are here, so run into them once in a while. And until recently, I used to see Thomas Steen fairly often, but he was back recently, but he's back to living in Sweden now. So yeah, I see some of them.
Cool.
Oxer?
What was the team that was versing when you had your favorite fight that you've seen? What was the team that it was against?
Well, there used to be some really good fights back in the day between the Calgary Flames and the Winnipeg Jets. Jim Kite against Tim Hunter. And
Kite used to win all of those fights.
Yeah, Kite used to win a lot. Yeah, he did actually. And there's a story in the book that I can tell here now too, because it involves the current coach of the Winnipeg Jets. They had a night one night in Calgary, and Tim Hunter had run into Brian Hayward, the Jet goaltender. And then Hayward decided to drop the gloves to go against Tim Hunter, which of course was not his smartest move. And that immediately brought out the benches. The bench is cleared, and now the fight moves, and everything's going on right in front of the Winnipeg Jet bench. And Rick Bowness, who's now the head coach, was an assistant coach at that time. He got really into this thing, so he stood up on the bench and he delivered a haymaker intended for Hunter. Hunter was on skates and just happened to move aside, and he nailed Randy Mitten. The linesman went down. Bones got a 3-game suspension. And but then the funniest part, Friar Nicolson used to have an annual charity auction for juvenile diabetes, and we used to get different things. And I managed to get a hold of the picture that was in the Calgary Herald the next day, and it was a perfect picture. I don't know why the Calgary Herald wouldn't let me have it. I contacted them. I wanted it from my book. They ignored me. But anyway, it was a perfect picture of this punch catching Randy Mitten and going down, and it was beautiful. And I had my wife put it into a frame, and we took it to the auction, and it was auctioned off. And you know who bought it? Rick Bowness. Oh, we got another question here.
Curt, I'd just like to know if you can share a couple of pranks that maybe went on, maybe in the booth or even with some of the team players or your fellow broadcasters.
Well, yeah, I suppose, I don't know if you'd call it a prank or not, but it wasn't a prank, but every once in a while, we talked about Friar Nicolson. He would have a diabetic shock in the middle of the game. And I got to the point where I could recognize it when it was coming, because all of a sudden he'd be talking about something. He says, a great play by Hawerchuk. And I'd get the operator to run and get him a drink, cola. So the operator would come, and now Friar, by this time, his mind would shut down entirely. And he couldn't think, he couldn't react. And I'd say, Friar, I got to give you some of this Coke. And he just, And so now I would call a commercial normally, and I would have to get his mouth open and pour the Coke in. And that wasn't easy to do. But sometimes I couldn't call a commercial at that time. So I wish they had YouTube in those days. I would really like to see a picture of me trying to pour Coke into Friar's mouth and calling the play-by-play at the same time. Because, yeah, so that was one of the goofy things that happened, and that's one of the stories in the book as well.
Hey, Uncle Curt.
Hey, Lisa.
What's your, this is fabulous, by the way, both of you guys up there, this is a big treat to see.
Thank you.
What is your second favorite sport? And if there is one past hockey, do you ever find yourself like broadcasting it in your head as you're watching?
Unlike anybody else, I enjoy football, and I really enjoyed the Bombers run, even the way it ended. What a tremendous football game it was. But I did broadcast some football at one time, junior football. But really, I think the sport that I enjoyed broadcasting the most wasn't hockey. I really liked broadcasting baseball. It was fun. And in fact, one of my color men, Dennis Schindel, sat right here, and we sit there on a Sunday afternoon in Yorkton calling a game between the Yorkton Cardinals and the Millville Millionaires. Be a beautiful day, the crack of the bat, and just totally enjoyable. And of course, you can talk a lot in between. It was easy to do. It was fun to do.
Yeah, well, he's also a heck of a skier. We had him out at Mississippi last year, and speaking of pranks, we got him biggest, greenest helmet you could possibly find and planted it right on his head. Looked like a huge garbage can. Took all kinds of pictures, like posted on social media. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I look at the man from outer space.
And we are reaching the top of the hour, but we do have time for another question.
I thought the last question that I want to get your opinion of yourself as a Trivial Pursuit player.
Probably the best. Yeah, we used to do a lot of that. We used to play a lot of sports trivia out at the lake, and I was saddled with this one for a partner all the time, so we quite often lost. But yeah, we had some great times, some great memories, and
there was hell to pay when he didn't get the hockey questions right.
Yeah, it was on. Yeah, anytime I got a hockey question wrong, how can you get that wrong? That's your business. And that's when you started calling me Bert Bielcack.
I still use that. I still use that. Whenever he's up at the once a year or so, he's up at the tees, lining up a shot. I'll break out the video camera, get it all queued up there. Now on the tee, Bert Bielcack. Usually crushes one right into the bush.
You got it. You got it. Yeah. Anyway, I understand we're just about out of time, so it's been a tremendous pleasure having you all here and having the opportunity to reminisce and enjoy some of this time. If you wanted me to sign anything or have a picture taken or anything else, well, that's what we're here for. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, both of you. What a pleasure to just be able to sit here and listen to some of those stories and just spend the time. Thank you for all of your questions as well. It's been great hearing from all of you folks and for your attention. We'll now move along to the signing portion, as Curt was indicating. So we'll just transport him to a table, which is just beside our cash desk. And then at that point, you can feel free to wander over and have a copy of the book signed. We have copies of the book at the table. We have copies of the book at the cash desk. Please feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book at some point before you leave the store. I'd also like to ask all of you to join me one more time in acknowledging not only Curt for sharing his memories and for sharing his work with us tonight, but also to Luke Keilback for hosting this evening. Thank you.
Good job, son.
And thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful night.
Curt, we hear great save.
Great.